Hello, everyone. I would like to give a quick example of something I've thought about when thinking about the impact that the virus has had on our economic systems as we've developed them. So this here is an epidemic calculator. I've taken the screenshot from this website here at github.io. It's pretty cool for as bad as all of this is. But with this, you can play with and adjust the numbers, and it shows you this graph about how the spread of the disease can happen. So you can adjust the R, and you can adjust things here. When you do, then it'll adjust, the number of fatalities, the number of infections and exposed, and you can adjust the curve. So as you change things, you can say make the curve smaller, for example, or maybe longer duration, things like that. So it's pretty neat. Now I've thought about this same thing in context when it comes to other issues. So what I would like to try to do is to simplify this graph a little bit, take all this stuff away, and kind of show this curve on a little simpler graph by coming down here. Now, the idea is the way this would work is it would be exponential growth. So if we were to have no policy to change or adjust this, the virus would grow, and it would grow exponentially and infect people. And it would be this massive, massive impact. But then as time goes on, we'd have less infections simply because we'd run out of people to infect. And the big idea these days is trying to flatten this curve, is to take this curve and reduce the exponential growth and have a curve that looks maybe something more like this. And it would spread out the infections over time and hopefully reduce the number of infections. And the whole real big reason of trying to do it that way is because of this line here. And this line here, this represents the number of hospitals that we have, and the number of hospital beds and the resources that we have. So as time goes on, they don't change. So if we do nothing, we have this big impact, and all these people here can be affected, and we have no ability to help these people, and that would possibly increase the number of deaths. So if we could flatten this curve to a point that we can actually deal with it, then hopefully we can slow down this spread and deal with this. Now, most everything about this right now is dealing with the medical resources that we have. And I've thought about this, and what about other resources that we have and the ability to supply and demand other things over time. So taking this same basic idea, but then applying it to other markets and other things that we produce. Here's an example of taking that same basic idea of looking at the medical resources that we have, flatten the curve to allow us to adjust for the amount of resources that we actually have. Do kind of the same thing with other things. So here's an example with toilet paper. Now the supply of toilet paper goes up and the demand for toilet paper goes down. Things do change, but there's a quote unquote normal amount. We can kind of look at this and we can think of this as the equilibrium of toilet paper, the supply and demand over time. Now, one of the things is right now, some of that is quite changing. So here's an example. People are going to the store these days and buying lots of supplies, worried that maybe there won't be supplies in the future. So they're buying lots of things. The thing is, they're buying more of some things than others, and toilet paper has been a big thing. And so as people have been buying more toilet paper than they normally do, stores have been running out of toilet paper. So the short-term demand of toilet paper has changed. So as an example, to try to graph the demand for toilet paper, as this outbreak has occurred and people are going to the stores afraid they might not be able to buy things, they're buying toilet paper and stocking up on lots of toilet paper. So the demand for toilet paper has been spiking. An interesting thing to consider is the demand for toilet paper, but also the use of toilet paper. So assuming that the virus goes away in a few months, assuming things don't get too much worse, then these people that have bought all this toilet paper, they've bought many months and months of supply of toilet paper. The thing is, you don't actually use the toilet paper any faster. You usually go to the bathroom about the same rate that you would be previously. And so let's say the virus does abate and things do go back to normal. The toilet paper market doesn't just jump back to normal as before. What ends up happening is there'll be a lull in the amount of toilet paper sales afterwards, because people have bought all this toilet paper and it takes them a long time to use it. They go through their supply, which means they won't actually be buying toilet paper any sooner than before. So it'll take some time. So the toilet paper market suddenly goes through this spike, but then we'll go back down and we'll go back to basically the normal amount of toilet paper. But we have this huge shortage and potentially surplus later as the toilet paper market tries to adjust for this. So we've taken us out of our normal equilibrium. We can eventually go back, but there's these issues. Now that's all fine for toilet paper. We have plenty of toilet paper available and that will adjust itself. But here's the thing, when you go into the store, you don't go in there just to buy toilet paper. There's a lot more foot traffic in the stores, and people are going there and stocking up on lots of other things too. So as people are going in there and buying more than normal, stores are having a problem where they're having shortages and not able to stock the things that people need. Now, it's not necessarily because there's a shortage of producing these things, but it's the fact that demand has suddenly spiked for a lot of these things. Now, thinking about the supply chain involved here, part of the problem is not that there isn't enough of the materials being made or enough of the supply of the things being made. It's the fact that there's not enough labor that's able to get those things to the store in time to satisfy the demand. Our supply chain networks are set up in such a way that there is kind of a quote unquote equilibrium for most products and most goods and services. So the amount that's supplied at any given time tends to equal the demand. And there's always shortages and surpluses, but there's usually not very large spikes like what's happening now. Now, considering this, I thought about this in the context of food. Now, it is true that food supplies, they go up and they go down based on the weather and lots of other things. So there is some volatility when it comes to food supply. But in general, markets are able to supply the food that we need. And there's a lot of waste that happens and things. But, there's not a lot of humongous changes, a lot of humongous spikes in the general food supply. And so we're able to adjust for these things. Now, I'm thinking about long term now with the virus, if it stays this way, some of the impacts that might happen. Now, I'll take the US food supply as an example. Right now, when you go into a store in the US, you're buying food or not buying food, depending on whether it's been able to supply to you or not, or the demand has increased a lot. But the food that we've been eating is food that has already been produced, food that has already been grown, food that has taken several months to get to the market. Now, springtime is coming now, which means for a lot of farms, it's time for that food to be picked and to be taken off the farm to be shipped to the market. Now, the US food supply relies heavily on labor that comes from countries outside of America. A large supply of the labor force that is used to pick fruit and vegetables come from Mexico and places like that. So now that springtime is coming, areas such as here and around here and all along the border down here, these places that grow lots of food, they need workers, and there's not enough supply of workers. And a lot of those workers come from Mexico or various other countries. And they cross the border, they pick the food, they'll pick the vegetables, and then they'll go back home. And this is a seasonal thing that happens every single year in the US. Now, this is not true with every food in the US, but it is true with a lot. Now, consider the fact that countries are blocking off their labor supplies and blocking off labor and closing their borders from each other and not flying airplanes to each other. But that also means people are not going across. And so now you don't have as many tourists, fine. But in cases like this, you might not have workers. Now, this isn't true for all food. Like, for example, here, corn and wheat in the US. Now, corn and wheat is grown in the middle of the US, and this has been mechanized. It doesn't take a lot of labor to grow these things. They're already been grown, they're going to be grown, and it's mostly robots and big tractors that are able to take this food off the farm. And then this food is processed, usually by robots, before it is then delivered. And even today, most food is still delivered by truck for you to get to the store. So in this process, there's really not a lot of workers in this area here. And there's really not a lot of workers that are involved in this part of the chain. But this part of this chain here does have a significant amount of workers as it here gets to the store. Now, fruits and vegetables, they're a little bit different story. Fruits and vegetables cannot be mechanized in the same way that food like corn and wheat can be. So fruit and vegetables, it still takes a lot of labor to go out there and pick the fruit and vegetables. So a lot of these laborers come from Mexico and other Latin American countries. And then the food is picked by hand. And then that food can then be delivered to manufacturing areas to be processed, which then can be transported out to stores. So in this process, there is a lot of labor that is used here, not quite as much necessarily here, still a lot here and still a lot that's used here. Now, if we close off the borders for an extended period of time, these workers here won't be able to pick the fruit, which can then ruin this supply chain along here. So some foods might see a spike in prices and a drastic reduction in supply potential. And consider the time that it is. It is currently March, going on April, so winter is now over, but a lot of these fruits and vegetables are going to start to be grown now and start to be harvested. So it does take time to pick this food and to grow this food before it can actually get to the market, which means this food tends to have a pretty inelastic supply, which we can graph as such. So we run into this problem here. What if these workers can't get out into the fields in time? The food still needs to be grown. The food might go bad in the middle of these farms with no one able to pick them. And then if the virus continues to spread, what if these workers get sick? Then we run into a problem. Not yet, we don't run out of food, but later this will happen. And this will happen also in the summer with other foods that will be time to harvest it at that time. So putting it on a graph, something like this, we run into this issue potentially. I'm not saying this has to happen, but there are these potential issues where we have a normal equilibrium that we would say, kind of what we tend to think of. But then here it is spring as the virus is attacking many parts of the world, and many parts of the world are starting to lock down. These parts of the world in their normal supply chain have food that's about to be grown. But if those workers are not able to get out into the fields because they're all quarantined or locked out, well, the food is still going to be there and it's going to spoil out in the farms. But then what if those workers get sick? Those workers tend to be very low income workers. They don't have a lot of access to health care. And if one of them gets sick, they live in small areas together, there's a very good chance that lots of them get sick. And suddenly we have a huge shortage of labor that can cause the supply of our food to drastically fall, which is happening at the exact same time, potentially, that people are kind of, with their animal spirits, getting worried and buying a lot more food. And if they see that there's shortages happening, well, people rationally think, I better buy as much of that as I can, which could increase demand even more at a time when supply is falling. Now, this won't be true with all foods. Things like corn and wheat can still be done. Even through the summer, they can be mechanized and still produced. But other fresh things like fruits and vegetables and other perishable things that have more inelastic supply might run into this problem. And the longer that this goes on, the bigger of an impact this might be. Can this happen? Will this happen? I have no idea. I sure hope not. I hope that makes sense. Okay, thanks. Bye.